Joining me now to go through the speech and to discuss his thoughts on it is a research associate at the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, Tom Switzer. Tom, thanks for your time tonight. What did you make of the speech, first of all? How did you rate it?
Oh, it was highly rated indeed. I think it was a quintessentially eloquent Obama speech. Probably his best speech since he's been president, quite frankly. You know, in years to come, when the history of the Obama presidency is published, there's a good chance that this chapter will be, this particular speech will be one of the chapters. I think it's very good. What struck me was that, during the Bush years, America was often accused of exporting democracy by military force to the Middle East. And here is President Obama in the heart of the Middle East saying that democracy is not an export commodity, but nevertheless America stands with the moderate and the broad cross-section of the Muslim world and the Arab world in the fight against Islamic extremism, also standing up for women's rights and human rights generally. So I thought it was a very good speech. It's one of those speeches I suspect that might aggravate some of the old guard of the Bush administration, but also many of the liberal hawks on the sidelines. But I think nevertheless it's probably just what the doctor ordered for American foreign policy in the Middle East.
I've got to say, it did hit a very, I suppose, a positive tone, and that olive branch was right throughout this speech, with President Obama quoting the Quran on a number of occasions. It seemed to me to be of course there were huge expectations going into it, but the way it was framed, the way that it touched every one of the thorny issues, it did seem to be one which had been framed well, written well, delivered well, but also with a great deal of substance.
Yeah, that's right, and I think also he was very good about focusing his own personal narrative into the equation. Also, the national story. I must confess I'm a real American-phile, and I had no idea that Morocco was the first country to recognise the United States in 1796, but that was a perfect line to use in that audience, I have to say. But also the whole notion of railing against the stereotyping of the Muslim world, just as it's wrong to stereotype the United States. I thought that was a great line. That was probably one of the lines of the night, actually, or the morning. This whole notion that let's look at each other the way we'd like to be looked at each other, and don't impose simplistic assertions on our way of life.
And the line was, as president, he takes it as his responsibility to fight against negative portrayals of Islam wherever they appear. It obviously was something that resonated with the audience. He got a huge cheer on that one, Tom. The other one that a couple of very big rounds of applause from the audience at Cairo University, and another one that really jumped out at me was when he made the commitment, reasserted his commitment, one, to close Guantanamo Bay, and two, to end torture as a policy of interrogation.
That's very true, but one also has to remember that on the first case study of the torture memos, the President did not release those memos, and he hasn't had the support of the United States Senate to close down Guantanamo. They voted against it 90-6 just recently. So, you know, this was a very good symbolic speech. I don't think it's a huge difference in kind. It's more a difference in degree, really. Symbolism counts, perception counts in politics. This has gone a long way to help reach out to the Muslim world, but I don't think we should overstate the significance of it. And those two examples, the torture and Guantanamo, demonstrate that point dramatically. And he knows this himself. He realises that some of the things that the Bush administration did were actually quite justified and need to be maintained. But one of the lessons, I think, Kieran, that struck me was the whole Bush doctrine of prevention, of regime change, of aggressive American unilateral action. That was all shelved, and he emphasised more conciliation and accommodation. And I think that's one of the lessons to be learnt from the Iraq War. And not so much that democracy is not an export commodity, but also that things like containment and deterrence, those twin pillars of the Cold War strategy that went missing in action during the Bush years, they can actually work against rogue states like Iran. He didn't spell it out there, but that was the message I felt from hearing him talking about the Iranian threat.
As you say, we can't overstate the impact of one speech, and certainly the President made that clear as well. And in his words, that one speech isn't going to change everything. But I want to get your thoughts on the specific area where he focused on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Do you think this might give it some impetus, the peace process? Is there any chance of moving forward? I mean, we still have to point out, of course, in the West Bank and Gaza, you've got two different Palestinian leadership groups. I mean, how do you move forward? The words were great, but how do you achieve any progress on this?
Well, you achieve it by putting pressure on the Israeli government, and the Israeli government is now led by Benjamin Netanyahu, by most accounts a hawk. And you'll notice that President Obama, more so than President Bush, has been very keen to put pressure on the Israeli government to close the settlements that have been expanding since the Oslo Accord in 1993. How he does that, I'm not sure, but nevertheless he's been more vocal than his predecessors, both President Clinton and Bush, in that regard.
Okay, on Iran, what did you make of the comments that he had on that? Of course, the Iranian issue, the nuclear development in that country has been the subject of enormous tensions. He says he wants to, again, with Iran, make it clear to its people that they're committed to a new future. What are the prospects, though, again, with the regime that is in place there?
Well, you have to remember Iran is about to have an election, and the fate of the President Ahmadinejad is pretty dicey. But the point to bear in mind about Iran, and this point doesn't get mentioned enough, even a lot of the moderate candidates for the election actually support Iran's right to develop nuclear technology and possibly even nuclear weapons. But it gets back to this fundamental point that we've learnt, I think, from the Bush era, that containment and deterrence can work against rogue states. There's no question that the Iranian nuclear threat is the most pressing regional issue, arguably more pressing than the Arab-Israeli conflict. And a lot of the states in the region are very concerned about the Iranian threat. But this is the big difference between rogue states and terrorists. Terrorists can run and hide. Rogue states have a mailing address. And if Iran, for argument's sake, cause any mischief and threaten American interests in the region, it would guarantee massive retaliation, possibly annihilation. Ronald Reagan called it the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. It could have worked against Saddam Hussein, and it can work against Tehran.
Okay, Tom, just finally, we've spoken about the specifics. As I mentioned at the start, he paid tribute to the contribution that Islam has made over the centuries. He also finished on some big picture ideals that he believes need to be addressed by the Muslim world. One of them was religious freedom. Another was women's rights. Were you surprised that he touched on that? Another sensitive issue, but he spoke about the need to foster women's rights. He says he's convinced our daughters can contribute just as much to society as our sons.
Well, the American impulse to promote freedom and democracy is very profound, and I don't think one should cynically dismiss it. It goes way back to Woodrow Wilson during the height of the World War I, when America, he said, went about to export democracy and make the world safe for democracy. I think President Obama, like most Democrats, he's heir to the Harry Truman tradition, the John F. Kennedy tradition, even the Bill Clinton tradition, strongly believes that America has a mission, if you like, American exceptionalism, as they say in American history, to promote America around the world and American ideals. So the issue of women's rights, as you say, is a provocative one, because one of the great clashes in the world today is this clash between Western modernity and conservative Islam, and it'll take more than just one speech to bridge that gap.
It's interesting, though, to see how this will resonate. There is the Iranian election coming up, the Lebanese election also in the next month as well. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out across the region. Tom Switzer, a Research Associate at the US Studies Centre, appreciate your time and appreciate your analysis tonight. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.